Hey there, everyone. For those of you who might not know who I am, my name is Connor. I'm a lot of things relevant to the white coat. I'm a resident physician, but the only thing I've been into as long as I've been into medicine is probably heavy music, which is why I've gotten this sort of moniker, or maybe made the moniker for myself, Dr. Deathcore. A lot of you might also know me from a series of reviews I've been doing for well over a decade now, actually, with most of my writing being for a website called New Transcendence. I'm not going to stop writing reviews. In fact, I prefer the written review to anything else, but times are changing. And I think in light of the changing times, it's time to implement something a little bit different. So I'm going to be doing a series of video reviews, nothing too ambitious, maybe one a week, one every other week, for some of the bigger, more anticipated releases that are coming out in a year that's already jam-packed with a bunch of really good shit. With that being said, the first release that I really want to start with is the self-titled record by a little band from Pennsylvania called The Last 10 Seconds of Life. Now, for those of you who might not know about The Last 10 Seconds of Life, here's a little history lesson just to catch you up to speed. The band was formed in 2010, they released the Justice EP, and then the pretty well-received full-length Know Your Exits in 2011, just a year afterwards. Now, I'm not going to go on and detail every record in their pretty impressive discography, but it's really important to know that throughout their tenure as a band, they've really creatively blended a lot of different elements into a backbone of a hybrid of metalcore and deathcore. A lot of those elements include things like some thrash elements, a lot of like thrash-heavy riffs, and then even some elements from hard rock, which became more prevalent on their record, The Violent Sound. The Last 10 Seconds of Life have also had their fair share of number changes, with the most notable being the change of vocalist on The Violent Sound going forward through their last couple releases. What makes their upcoming album, their self-titled release coming January 28th, different from their other records? In short, this is probably the most concentrated, distilled, and pure form of The Last 10 Seconds of Life that we've seen to date. Elements from just about every one of their releases seems to show up somewhere on this release, with a lot of callbacks to their critically acclaimed record, Soulless Hymns. Now, Soulless Hymns is what many people consider to be their magnum opus, and I would argue that it probably is their magnum opus until now. To get things started, The Last 10 Seconds of Life, which is a reference to the self-titled record, not the band, although it's kind of one and the same, is just a ruthless fucking release. From the very beginning, Invictus Unto Fire, you're just bombarded with percussion that is out of this world. Their percussionist Steven Sanchez, which is a switch up from the percussionist on Machina Non Grata, who was David Bowder, comes out of the gate with a lot of really, really technical flourishes into what is otherwise a pretty solid, sturdy foundation of percussion. That's amplified by a lot of really, really thick bass work, and that bass really pops in songs like The Sabbath, and even later into the release, even The Sickness in Seattle. At the end of the day, though, when it comes to The Last 10 Seconds of Life, probably one of the things that has set them the most apart to me has been their guitar tone, and the work of their guitarist, Wyatt McLaughlin. Wyatt's work is, on this record, probably its most technical, and its heaviest simultaneously. Now, when we go back to Machina Non Grata, which probably was their heaviest release up until this one, we're looking at a guitar tone that sounded pretty similar to that of Soulless Hymns and to that of In Vivo Ex Vivo. Now, that tone is pretty similar throughout their self-titled release that's coming up, but there's a lot of changes that give it a little bit more depth. On Soulless Hymns, one of the things I loved about it was that it had sort of this almost like a tinny kind of a ring to a lot of the higher notes. That's pretty absent now, and you get a really, really thick sound from just about anything he plays, even the more ethereal and ambient stuff that includes a lot of their interludes, really just feels fucking a lot beefier than it ever did before. How does this work with their overall dynamic? Well, it makes everything hit a little bit harder. And that's really important when we get into one of the actual pitfalls of the release, which we'll talk about in a little bit. But to put it into a nutshell, the instrumentation on The Last 10 Seconds of Life's self-titled release is very, very punctual. It's absolutely punishing. with Steven Sanchez's drumming just really, really blowing my mind as far as a lot of the things that he does and fills that he chooses to implement throughout the record. And then the work between Mike Menaker and Wyatt McLaughlin when it comes to guitar and bass is just out of this world. And it's probably the best that duo has been to date. Aside from the guitar work that the last 10 Seconds of Life had provided to heavy music, one of the things that really also stands out to them is the vocal dynamic. And it's really, really hard to talk about the last 10 Seconds of Life without talking about Storm Stroke, because he absolutely defined their early works. A lot of people, myself included, were really, really apprehensive when John Robert C. stepped up. And I think that apprehension was mixed with even a little bit of disappointment on parts of the Violent Sound, just because it was a departure from the last 10 Seconds of Life that we knew and loved, especially coming off of Soulless Hymns, which is just a really, really fucking good record. However, I think as the Violent Sound sort of settled into its place within the last 10 Seconds of Life's discography, and as we got Machina Non Grata, which was incredible on John Robert C.'s front, we kind of got used to him as a vocalist, and we accepted where he sounded like Strope and where he didn't sound like Strope. I would argue that on the last 10 Seconds of Life's upcoming self-titled record, if there was any part of his vocal efforts that were ever trying to emulate that Storm Strope feel, they're gone now, and it's the best he's ever sounded. His voice is really rich and dynamic throughout the entire release, and he's assisted by McLaughlin in several portions where there's a lot of singing to counteract his really, really low, gritty, guttural tones. As you sort of get further and further into the record, you're met with more and more vocal dynamism. As we start with tracks like Invictus Under Fire and Zap Wasn't Invited to the Party, we hear a lot of his more standard like deathcore approach, just really, really deep, like I said, thick and meaty gutturals, some piercing high screams, and a lot of that mid-range, that raw yell that he plays around with. And that's all awesome. But then as we get into songs like Vampire, or a blood ballad, which is a grower, definitely don't write it off the first time you listen to it. You're met with not only more of his range, but more of McLaughlin's singing. And that intro at first is enough to put you a little bit off the record being the song. However, you gotta let it sit with you, because as that song evolves, you're met with just such an incredible amount of vocal dynamism that really, really becomes one of your favorites. At least it became one of my favorites, and I'm pretty sure it will for y'all as well. In addition to songs like Glory Be to Misery and The Sabbath and Invictus Under Fire that we've already talked about in a little bit more detail, there are some songs that absolutely deserve a shout out. And one of the ones that I think we really need to spend at least a little bit of time taking a look at is Guillotine Queen. Now, we've already heard Guillotine Queen once, right? Or at least if you're not new to the last 10 Seconds of Life, you've heard Guillotine Queen once. And if you are new to the last 10 Seconds of Life, go listen to that record. Turn this off, go listen to that record. The new Guillotine Queen isn't a cover of the original. It's not a redo of the original. It's an entirely new song that sort of views it from a different perspective and adds a different sort of flavor to the entire character that we know and the entire story that we kind of got throughout Soulless Hymns. At the end of the day, the last 10 Seconds of Life's new record is not a concept record, but it does have a lot of conceptual throwbacks to their previous work, which gives it a lot more cohesive a feeling when compared to things like Machina Non Grata or The Violent Sound, when sort of the new member changes and the prolonged hiatus were still sort of settling into place and filling in. With Guillotine Queen, the new Guillotine Queen, I have to keep on making that clarification. The Guillotine Queen 2, maybe? Is that what I call it? I don't know. It's just fucking brutal. And I hate using that word because it's like the brutal shit from like scene deathcore days, and like, yeah, I get it, my pants are kind of tight, and like, yeah, I get it, I probably used that 10 years ago when I was in high school, or college, I guess, at this point. But the point is that Guillotine Queen by the last 10 Seconds of Life is a fucking ass beater. The guitar is pissed, the drums pissed, the vocals really fucking pissed. It still has a little bit of singing in it, just a little bit, but enough to sort of add that contrast to the really, really aggressive elements that make the aggressive elements even that much more aggressive. So out of all the songs I come back to on this record, Guillotine Queen is definitely one of the ones I've spun the most. With that being said, there really aren't a lot of skip-worthy tracks to the record, which is why it's important to sort of take a look at the entire thing in like a big picture to see where it really falls as far as a rating goes. So how do we distill the great, okay, and not so great parts of the last 10 Seconds of Life, self-titled record, The Last 10 Seconds of Life, into the conclusion at the end of this video, because the whole point of this video is that it's shorter and something that more people will actually sit through and watch as opposed to read the entire fucking article. The best parts are really most of the record. It's a record that's 90% highlights and 10% things I would probably stylistically change. The first and foremost being that instrumentally, this is the tightest, most technical, heaviest, and catchiest that the last 10 seconds of life have ever sounded, and it's all four of those facets in equal parts as you progress through the entire release. You start off with really them at their most relentless and ruthless that we've heard them at least since the Warpath EP, if not before. And then you also hear them evolve into something catchier and more diverse and dynamic as the record really, really carries out. The fact that by the end of the record, you're caught with these sort of instrumental interludes that don't even sound like they necessarily came from the last 10 seconds of life, which again is both good and bad, and we'll get to that in a moment. Another area where the last 10 seconds of life's record really, really excels is where it comes to the vocal dynamism that's abundant throughout the release. And I kind of harped on this already, right? We already sort of know this, that John Roberts, he sounds the best that he's ever sounded before. And I think that one of the really cool things about his vocal work alongside the instrumental progression is that we hear eras of the entire history of the last 10 seconds of life. I think we hear a lot of ideas that really sort of conceptually and instrumentally complete some of the things that were established on In Vivo, Ex Vivo, and Soulless Hymns. And some of these are really pretty on the nose when it comes to the overt song titles that are, Guillotine Queen as a redo, and then also the Ballad of the Butcher, but a little bit of a origin story to the Ballad of the Butcher, if you will. I think we also get some ideas that probably would have made the violent sound stand out a lot more and fill out that record a lot more. So it's cool to hear them sort of returning to some elements of that sound just to say like, hey, fuck you, we can do it. Finally, I think you also get some of the elements of Machina Non Grata really, really completed and filled out throughout this release. Because if I had any critique for Machina Non Grata, it was that between the production and the overall runtime of the record, it felt a little bit unfinished. Like there was a lot of material, but in scope, it was just missing something cohesive. Where were the last 10 seconds of life really not, everything that they could be on this record? My only complaint is it seems like we waited a while for this release with a lot of hype, a lot of excitement, and then at the end of the day, we got a lot of really, really good songs, don't get me wrong, but we also got a lot of interludes, a lot of sort of dead space. And this is really, really just really heavy on the back end of the record. I think of the last 5 songs, I feel like 3 of them kind of don't necessarily contribute a lot to the entire experience. In parts they do, in parts it's really, really cool to have that interlude to give you some breathing room, because otherwise you just get the absolute shit beat out of you for 40 minutes, which it might be your thing, might not be your thing, I don't know. But I also feel like that we're given a lot of interludes that just, at the end of the day, you're like, man, I really could have done without that, or man, I really wish that was just another full band song. And that's sort of, when the only thing you have to complain about is that you didn't get as much the last 10 seconds of life as you wanted, that's ultimately a good thing, right? So I think I'd rate this record at the end of the day a really strong 9 out of 10. It's heavy, it's catchy, it's fun, it's like a fucking violent party in audio format, and by the time you're done with it, you just feel hungover, which again, good or bad, depends on what you're into. But if I had it to do over again, or if I had any big suggestions I would make, it would be just maybe spread out the interludes and not leave them all sort of sitting at the end of the record to kind of add a little bit of dead weight to what was otherwise a really, really exceptional listening experience. So, I think that wraps up the first video installment to a Doc Deathcore reviews type deal that I'm going to try getting out here for you. I don't know if I'm going to make a YouTube for this or not yet, so I guess like, follow, share, whatever if I do make a YouTube. If not, let me know what you liked about it, let me know what you didn't like about it, let me know what I can do better, and let me know what releases you might want to hear about in the future in a video as opposed to an article format, because I definitely want to make this something I do more often. It's kind of fun to just talk and not actually sit down and write shit and be a fucking nerd for 40 minutes. All right, well, until next time.